This is the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast, brought to you by Heather Rose Jones. The show looks at lesbian and sapphic themes in history and literature, and historical fiction with queer female characters, including fantastic versions of the past. We present research, interviews, news of the field, book listings, and original historical fiction for your enjoyment. For even more historic research, check out our blog. Today, the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast is delighted to be interviewing Erica Friedman, a historian of Yuri manga and anime, whose book, By Your Side, The First 100 Years of Yuri Anime and Manga, is just being published by Journey Press. Erica is not simply a fan of Yuri, but is a scholar and critical writer on the topic with an academic background in library science and comparative literature. She has lectured on the topic at conventions, film festivals, and universities. Welcome, Erica.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Heather.
Since the listeners may have a wide range of familiarity with the genre, why don't you start with a brief definition of what Yuri is?
Well, to begin with, Yuri, as we describe it at Yuri-Con, is any anime, manga, or other derivative media like fan fiction, film, live action that shows intense emotional connection, romantic love, or physical desire between women. Yuri is a genre not confined to the gender or sexuality or age or of the audience, but the perception of the audience. Or as I say on my blog, Okazu, Yuri is any anime or manga with lesbian content without lesbian identity.
Okay. So what are the roots of Yuri? What sort of media did it evolve from? Who is creating it? Who is the intended audience? And how does it fit into cultural attitudes towards same-sex love in everyday life? And I suspect I have just prompted you for the entire contents of your book.
This is about 4 hours of conversation, yes, exactly. So to begin with, Yuri has literary roots in girls' culture of the 1920s and 30s in Japan. Girls' culture started in Taisho period Japan as Western influences were filling out the way adolescence was understood. And that is true literally, like, adolescence is a 1920s construct practically everywhere in the world. So at that time, British and French and American, Russian forces, organizations were moved into Japan, and you got same-sex schools being developed, and like things like the Young Women's Association and Young Men's Association kind of schools, plus religious schools. And in that hothouse environment, in order to sort of curb adolescent passion, what a lot of the school systems did was they created a culture within that school where you would admire same-sex older students. So you had the senpai kohai relationship became sort of the focus. In girls' school, what you would have is a sense of one-sama, an older sister who would take you under their wing and you know, just sort of walk you through the school and life, and you would have passionate, sometimes platonic, sometimes romantic relationships during the school system. And Yuri literature began in that environment. So you had girls' magazines of the 1930s, where women would write in stories of those passionate relationships, letters to their one-sama or their younger sisters, older sisters or younger sisters. And they would talk about how much they admire and love these people. And a lot of times those relationships kept on into adulthood. I mean, that's actually a thing that exists for real, where somebody who is an admired senpai becomes somebody that you are friends with for your whole adult life as well. And sometimes, of course, they're ships in the night. So in that environment, the letters and the short fiction that grew up in these girls' magazines became sort of an anchor of girls' culture. And it's not all meant to be specifically lesbian, much of it is not, but the passionate friendships are a cornerstone of that. Into that environment was a woman called Yoshie Nabuko, and she wrote a number of stories that are relatively famous in Japan in the way that, like, when I was growing up, everybody in my age in 6th grade had read Little House on the Prairie. And all the Laura Ingalls Wilder stuff was like just a cornerstone of girls' American culture. They had Yoshie Nabuko's Hana Monogatari, which is like Flower Tales. And she had a story called Yana Ura no ni Shoujo, Two Maidens in the Attic. And that story codified so many of the tropes that Yuri is built on that I kind of identify that as like the defining first Yuri work. It does things that even today we say this thing is still like a typical Yuri trope, like the very fact that the two maidens are in an attic room together is just a constantly repeated Yuri trope. Or there's a scene where there's a piano duet that is a very constant Yuri trope. Or there's a wonderful scene at the end of the book where Akitsu, the quote unquote older student, turns to Akiko, who is the protagonist, and says to her, "Come with me to the outside world." And 80 years later, in Revolutionary Girl Utena manga, Anshi turns to Utena and says, "Come with me to the outside world." And I went, oh, that's the same scene. And I realized that what was being referenced there was a literary tradition. And so I was like, okay, if there's literary tradition here, what else am I missing? So at that time, this is back in the late 90s, I started tracing backwards, and I've been writing about it and talking about it and obsessing about it ever since. And the more I go forward, the more I find backwards too. And it's been fascinating.
Yeah, I find it interesting because when you're talking about, the 1920s and the invention of adolescence and the culture of single gender schools, and of course that same thing was happening in the US and in Britain
and France and everywhere else.
Yeah, with like boarding school culture and the culture in girls' schools of crushes or smashes, where it was seen as a valuable, a worthwhile part of your emotional development.
It's safe. It's a very safe way to be emotionally developing. And having a same-sex passionate friendship was totally, I mean, you've talked about this 1,000 times on your podcast, where that is a safe way to be. It's much safer than if you were to fall in love with a boy, because that could cause all sorts of problems.
Up to the point when, the times shifted slightly and suddenly these became suspect. And,
yes.
Freud.
And we could thank Freud for that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the culture, the homosocial culture of schools, and you've already mentioned that this is not about lesbian identity as such. So how does it relate to current contemporary sexuality, to lesbian culture?
And of course, that is the most complex question in the world, right? That's the question. Well, and the answer is it kind of doesn't, but now it sort of is becoming. So when I say that Yuri is lesbian content without lesbian identity, and that's because when I do reviews on my blog, if something has lesbian identity, I am a lesbian or we are a lesbian couple, that goes under the LGBTQ plus category. It is the queer manga. It is, and there is a body of queer manga right now. But up until the 2000s, there was, I'm not going to say there was no queer manga, but it wasn't as much a thing. There was gay manga here in the West, and that really developed a real identity in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. But in manga culture, because Yuri was this trope that was in all of the other demographic genres, you found kinds of Yuri in stuff for boys, for girls, for men, for women, and it all looked a little different. And it wasn't until fandom really got online, and I've actually talked about this, I did a whole panel about this on Macadamia this past year in 2021, about when fandom got online and they all went, oh, okay, it's all a thing. And so fandom started going, wait a second, where are the queer characters, right? And the thing that was happening in Japan at the same thing was the creators that were going, well, the queer folks coming up who were also mangaka were going, where are the queer characters? Like, you can have these Yuri relationships, but nobody says they're gay. And of course, a very popular gay trope is gay for you in the 90s and thousands was like, I'm not gay, I'm just gay for you. And it's like, I mean, there were panels all the time in conventions at the time. So what happened is, as the queer audience, and as the audience becomes more queer, and that is very much a real thing that I'm seeing in real time, which is fabulous. is demanding more genuine representation. Creators who are queer started going, well, I'm not doing Yuri manga, I'm not doing that because that's not for me. I'm doing lesbian manga, or I'm doing beyond manga, or I'm doing gay manga. Gay men are writing gay manga. So you have the gay creators. But here's the other thing. Yuri is the only genre that's created by men, by women, for men, women, girls, boys. It's really the only genre that has no specific audience. The main four demographic genres in manga are for boys, for girls, for men, for women. And everything is sort of assumed to be that audience. BL, boys love, which is gay manga, it's male-male relationships done by women for women, is really a subset of shoujo and josei, which is by women for women. Yuri has roots in all of the genres, and it's the only thing that's come up that is just has no homogeneous identity. So it's just Yuri, and Yuri is, as I always say, for anyone who likes Yuri. You can find something that's for guys, for women, for girls, for boys, but it doesn't make it not Yuri. So as the queer audience, as queer creators are coming up, it's getting gayer. And it's really interesting to watch because the audience is actually demanding that, and has been since the 2000s, and more even 2010s. We're going, where are the gay characters in our Yuri? Where are the lesbians in the Yuri? And more and more and more, we're starting to actually see lesbian creators coming out. I did a video last year that was, are there any queer creators in Yuri? And even as I was filming that, people were coming out online. I was like, it was like I had to add like 3 new people in by the end of the video, and a bunch more have come out. And at the end of last year, beginning of this year, there was an anthology called Boyish 2. It was a Butch Yuri anthology. So it was Butch X Butch. So it's not Butch Femme, it's Butch. And that was fabulous because it was all crowdfunded. And so we had people identifying as Butch lesbians doing this Butch manga anthology for a queer audience. And so that's something that I could not have imagined 10, 20 years ago, 5 years ago even.
It sounds, I'm getting this impression, and maybe it's wrong, that what you're saying is that Yuri is like a type of content, but that it can have different flavors depending on the intended audience.
Absolutely.
So what would be some of the differences in those flavors?
So for girls, shoujo manga will have perhaps a story of 2 girls in one of those hothouse environment schools where, you know, everything is very sweet and gentle. And maybe at the end of the day, they say, I love you, or I like you even. And maybe they kiss, and maybe they just hold hands and look longingly into each other's eyes. It's all very sweet and innocent. That same story for men might be in a hothouse environment where it's the most ridiculous school you could possibly imagine. And it's absurd. And everybody's so filthy and rich. And it's just this ridiculous environment. And everyone's groping each other. And, you know, it's a lot of sexual behavior without maybe necessarily even saying, I love you, but like just lots of sort of pervy behavior. And that's not always true. I mean, I don't want to say that that's 100% of the true. Maybe for women, you might have a story about, I don't know, a ladies' bar. Or women in the office who find themselves falling in love. There's a wonderful manga called If We Leave on the Spot by Inui Ayu that's out by Manga Planet. It's only digital right now. And it's about 2 women who would never in a million years have identified themselves as gay. And yet they meet in the office and they start going out and they're like, you know what, this is the real thing. We're together here. And it's really lovely. It's just, but what I love about it that makes it for women is they care about their clothes, and they're just adult women, and they care about, like, let's go to this cafe, it's cute. You know, I mean, it's stuff that I have conversations with my wife about, oh, look at the style of this place. Oh, these drinks are so cute, you know, whatever. And that's what makes it for women as opposed to for anybody else. Stuff for boys, you might get like the cool lesbian on the motorcycle roaring in, or maybe a predatory lesbian best friend or something. Each one of those tropes comes from the different things. And when you put them into Yuri, now we have Yuri magazines. When you get them there, they all have equality. So you can have all of those in one story, and it's one big giant story, or you can have something completely fantastic. Like I'm in Love with the Villainess, where it's taking from isekai, which is where people are sucked into games that they like, or so this other world. And they have to play as a character in the game that they used to play in our world. And that's like a completely fantasy story, and not at all tied necessarily to any of those specific demographic genres, but it's a whole new genre of its own.
Interesting. So I am pretty much an outsider to manga and anime culture. It's like my passing acquaintances are when I was a kid in the 60s, I loved Kimba the White Lion,
Of course. Tezuka is a really major point for everybody, yeah.
And the one manga that I have, hunted down, and you are very familiar with this because you were the editor, is Rose of Versailles. And I heard about it because somebody said, "Oh my God, your book, The Daughter Mystery, has the same vibe." So I've got the first reprinted volume of that, and I don't know when the others are going to come out. But so I'm not intimately familiar with it. And because I'm involved in science fiction fandom, I get a lot of awareness of the culture and the fandoms. I've gotten the impression that in let us say in US fanish culture, because that's what I'm familiar with, that fans of Yuri and fans of yaoi tend to be distinct communities to some extent.
Sometimes, and it's always complicated because the natural tendency for Westerners, in my experience, is to have very specific layers and levels. And one of the very first things that happened in fanish culture was we have to differentiate between stuff with sex and stuff with romance. And it's we're not the movie authorities, and Japan is not America, and we don't need to do that. So there was a real tendency for the last 30 years to try to make yaoi versus Yuri. And I always said, I don't think so. They're not opposite sides of the same coin. They're the same sides of the opposite coin. So BL, yaoi, or BL, boys love, is male-male relationships done for women, by women. And so there's a lot of tropes in there that are a lot to do with sexual politics in Japan. And of course, individual creator needs, which is a whole nother thing, because when you start talking about what are genres, it's well, then we have to cut out all these things that don't fit into that. It's a whole thing. But what happened was a lot of people who like BL also like Yuri, and a lot of Yuri creators started in BL or always do BL. A lot of queer creators did BL because there was a bigger market for that for a long time. And now they're moving back into Yuri. So you get a lot of in and out. So there's not clear identities in Japan. But you're right, here in America, because yaoi, because BL came here first, it has a 15 years of existence here in the West that Yuri didn't have. And so you had a lot of folks getting involved in the BL communities and sort of really identifying with that. And when I started writing and talking about Yuri back in the early 2000s, I'd go to events and I would literally get, ooh, yaoi. But those specific people were themselves emotionally immature. They weren't really comfortable. And you could tell when you sat in a BL panel or a yaoi panel and they tee at the sexuality. It's these are people who are not talking about this as oh, let's talk about how this part is fetishized and this part might be realist, or maybe these characters written more like how women would talk, or maybe this is sort of an idealized masculinity. And they weren't talking like that. They're going tee glowing cones. And it took 20, 30 years for that whole community to mature. I just don't see any of that anymore. I mean, I'm sure there must be people out there, but like with everything else, I just feel like the whole community has matured so much in BL that I really don't see a lot of that separatism that I saw initially.
Yeah, and again, I'm coming at it from a different angle and a different set of experiences than you. But what I'm getting from some of what you're saying is that the Western attitude towards erotic content in media is coloring the reception of all of this material in a way that is unnatural to the context in which it's being created. And I know that, as a writer of lesbian fiction myself, there's this weird, two-sided sexualizing of lesbian identities in fiction. On the one hand, people who are, maybe homophobic, it's like, oh, it's got lesbian characters, it must be all about sex.
Right. It has to be 18 plus, right.
On the other hand, you've got the lesbian fiction readership saying, this isn't lesbian fiction, it doesn't have enough sex in it.
Right.
And,
right. And Yuri was really complicated because if it's Sailor Moon, and like Sailor Moon was a huge gateway manga. So if it's Sailor Moon, this is a manga for 11-year-old girls. It's an idealized princess, magical princess fantasy where the boy is the damsel in distress. And there are two characters who, when they show up, are so obviously an intimately involved couple who we don't say that about them. We never say that. In 25 years, that has never been said. On the other hand, in 25 years, not only has our reading of them changed a lot. When they were initially designed, they were designed to be seen as a Takarazuka couple. So the one character was an otokoyaku. She was a woman who played a male role, and the other one was sort of so she was an idealized man, and the other character was an idealized feminine woman, and the two of them were this perfect couple. And now we look at them, we see Haruka is sort of maybe gender fluid or gender non-binary, and maybe Chihiro is still high femme, and their relationship hasn't changed, but now we're seeing like the marketing sort of acknowledging them as a romantic couple.
And as I understand it, in the American translation,
the anime,
that the entire relationship as a relationship was initially erased.
Initially, it was hilariously related. So this was the Deke dub. This is super famous back in the 90s when Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon became the cornerstones of Toonami. And they really broke the wall for anime and manga. I mean, like people knew about it. Like we all knew about Ranma, we knew about stuff. But man, on Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball Z just broke the wall down, and because it was on after school on TV where people could watch it for free. And what happened was, when the third season shows up, and when Haruka and Michiru show up, they have Amara, who is Haruka, the more masculine character, and Michelle are cousins. And so what happens is, because you can't change the body language or the way they look at each other in the anime, they now look like incestuous cousins. There is literally no way to read them any other way, because they couldn't change anything else. Now, I have to say, that is a very funny relic. Since then, Viz Media has put out a definitive version of the anime, and the thing I want to say about that, and it's available in Hulu. It's also the movies, and I think some of the anime are available. The Crystal anime are available on Netflix. But the thing I want to say about this is, when Viz did the dubs this time, the people they hired to play the roles loved the series the way I love the series. They cared about the characters. And so they weren't coming in and going, all right, what's this character about? They're like, I have wanted to be Michiru my whole life. And I'm not joking, because the woman who played Michiru was like, this is my ideal role. This is the one that got me an anime. And they play them beautifully. I'm not a dub fan usually. Not that I have anything against it. I'm a purist. I like the subs. Also, Ogata Megumi's Haruka was the reason I just fell into anime massively. So when they do it and I'm going, yes, this is Haruka Michiru, I'm not listening to an American actor reading the lines. I'm going, yes, this is how Haruka and Michiru would sound. This is how they sound. And it's beautifully done. And so, yes, that was the history, but Viz has really, really done the right way now. And so we have an anime that doesn't make us want to cry.
So, of course, my focus in this podcast and on my blog is about historical fiction and history.
Yes.
What can you talk about? Is there like a genre specifically historically set, Yuri?
Well, there isn't specifically. I do want to say, absolutely, The Rose of Versailles is one of the keystone pieces in Yuri manga. And we talked about that briefly. I do want to mention that you had done a number 25 episode, which talks about what I call the girl prince trope. And the Rose of Versailles is the thing that really elevates the girl prince trope, this masculine presenting woman who is raised to be a man, but struggles a lot with her own identity and who she wants to be, because she is living in the years leading up to the French Revolution. And so as a noble, as a woman, as a military commander, she has all these conflicting feelings. And so if you like historical fiction, the thing about the Rose of Versailles that I absolutely think would sell it to you is that every single thing in the Rose of Versailles is historically accurate, except for the parts that aren't. I mean, you have to keep Wikipedia open because you're like, was that real? Yeah, that was real. Like the affair of the necklace, in which this random common woman wrote these stories that appeared to claim that Marie Antoinette was having a lesbian love affair. That was actually true. And she made a lot of money. She wrote like 7 books about this. So that sort of thing is absolutely true. And if you didn't know that, it would come as a great shock. The main character, Oscar Francois de Jarget, is not real. But everything that happens around her is, and right to the very end. So the first 5 volumes of the series is out, which is the entire original series, which ran from 72 to 74, and then the 40th anniversary extra chapters. And the thing that we're missing, I'm sorry, the 10th anniversary extra chapters. We're missing one more volume, which I know will be published because I edited that as well. And that's the 40th anniversary extra chapters. And so when that comes out, it'll be a full, complete set at 6 volumes. And
okay, I did not realize the additional volumes were out. I only have volume 1. Clearly, I have some shopping to do.
Yeah, as 1 through 4 are the original manga. So that's the original series as it came out in Japan in 1972 to 74. And I actually have one of the original magazine issues. I found it in Japan and I was like, mine, this is totally mine. Like, I'm totally taking this. And it's the climax of the story, which I will not give away. Although it's the French Revolution. So I'm thinking if you thought about it a little bit, you might be able to figure it out. So that one I think is your number 1 hit. Also in episode 175, Nairi Bakalian mentions a story called Yellow Rose. And I want to talk a little bit about that. In the 20s, I told you that Yoshio Nabuko wrote a series of genre-defining, generation-defining stories called Hana Monogatari, Flower Tales. What those stories were was an exploration of girls' lives. And this is really unique. She wrote these short stories that are just about girls in Japan. They were contemporary to her time. And as they go on, you can see how life changes. Because while they're fiction, they're drawing heavily on the kinds of lives that girls at that time would know, going to these schools, finding these friendships, these deep, intense friendships, and often just losing them to things like families moving or marriage or death from disease or their own struggles with having to support their own families. And you could see in these stories how technology is changing really rapidly. We talk about the change of technology, the pace of changing technology now. In Taisho period Japan, all of a sudden trains and cars and typewriters and everything was changing very rapidly. Technology is always changing rapidly in contemporary lives. And in Yellow Rose, you see something, I think it's an outstanding story. Sarah Frederick did an incredible job. Sarah's a friend of mine. I think she did an absolutely outstanding job in the translation. It's a short story that talks about a woman who a few months ago was a student at a school, and now she's going back to the school as a teacher. So she's a year or 2 years older than the student she's surrounded by. And there's a very brief moment of connection with a student on the train. And the train is such a metaphor as it's roaring to this new school. And you're thinking, wow, is that not just this metaphor of the future rushing, at you, my God. And then they have this brief, intense moment and it sticks around and they start becoming a little closer. And when their conversations happen, they're conversing about classical literature and Sappho, but also modern literature and the changing times. And the girl who is the teacher realizes that this may become too much. She's putting both of them in danger. So she leaves and goes to America, which is there is another trope of Yuri for years to come, where you leave to be freer and you go to America. And she goes to America and basically buries herself in a job. And when we see her at the last, there's a desk in a basement in Colorado that she's been typing on. And that's how she just buries her desire, her worries, her life. And the whole thing is just so much in this teeny little space. And I was so blown away by the translation. It was just so good. So that's a great one. And generally speaking, I'm a fan of contemporary fiction that becomes historical because we're looking at it 50 years later. I'm not a huge fan of historical fiction as such. There's another piece but this is Japanese, so I can't really recommend this unless people read Japanese, but there's Otome no Minato. It was by Kawabata Yasunari and Nakazato Tsuneko, who at the time was considered to be a secretary, but turns out to have done probably most of the writing. And so now they're co-authors. And it's about, again, two girls at a private school for girls. And again, about the changing times, but also about sort of a passionate triangle where it's a third-year middle school student and a second-year high school student, and they become Onesama and Moto. And then a first-year high school student tries to break them up. And she uses technology to do that. So when they're on vacation and she's like, oh, let me teach you how to ride a bicycle. Let me take you to English language classes and all this cool, new, modern stuff. And in the end, she loses. and the original partnership stays. And at the end, and I love this scene, this is so important, they promise to continue writing and being friends forever, which is a trope that did not survive. And in a lot of the 90s and thousands and 2010s, particularly the boys' versions of these girls would never see each other again. They'd be married and they'd go away, and there's no technology and there's absolutely no way to communicate, and they would just disappear and be out of their lives. And I'm thinking, telephones exist. Do you not have telephones? There's a manga that I really like. In the last scene, they're literally the two characters. It's in the modern day. The two of them are holding their cell phones in their hands and going, oh, wait, we're not going to see each other for another year. We won't be able to speak. And I'm like, you're literally holding your cell phones in your hands. You're never going to speak again. What is that? So sometimes that sort of thing happens. But so I do really like contemporary stuff that when you look back at it, you realize that it's a snapshot of that time.
Okay, this is going to be the closest I'm going to come to a hardball question.
Okay.
You're not Japanese.
I am not.
You have this enormous familiarity and knowledge and, of course, love of this Japanese media, but you're inevitably coming to it as a cultural outsider.
I am always do, yes.
So how do you feel that affects your relationship to the material, and how does your critical approach to it engage with that reality?
That's a damn good question. You're right. That's good hardball. Okay, so I am always upfront because I started writing fan fiction like so many other people, and then I started writing published fiction, and I mostly started writing about Yuri on my blog in review form. The way I do a review is I surface my biases always straight up front. I'm an older American, white, Jewish, Northeastern, outside New York City, lesbian. And this is who I am, and this is how I read things. And you can't tell me to read things and not read them through my own lens. So when I read anything, I'm very, very upfront about this is how I'm reading it. So for instance, when I read Yoshino Buko's work, I know that her life, she shared most of her life with another woman. I'm going to look at that and say, I've been to their house. I've seen the room where they used to sit and drink tea and look out on their yard. And I'm thinking, there's no way they were just buddies, and you can't look at me and say, well, she didn't identify as a lesbian, so you can't say she's lesbian. Yeah, you know what? Yes, I can. Because that's what we call that now. I could call it a Boston marriage. I could call it a passionate friendship, or I could just say, yep, they were totally gay. And so when I surface that bias and that lens, you as a reader are free to go, idiot, and toss it out the window. Like, that's not it. No, they didn't mean it that way. Well, maybe they didn't. But you know what? I also feel like I can see what you maybe can't see, because I do have the gaydar that you lack. And I don't think that is something that I should hide. Like, Yuri fandom is based on this character having that vibe, and these two characters, I saw them looking at each other for more than 2 seconds in this animated film that, is not real people. These things are what Yuri fandom is built on, right? This Yuri's love of Shiori signified only by her head in a locket that tortured her. There's no way that there's no lesbian relationship there, yet we all knew that was what was being said. Because we saw that when Shiori was looking at the guy, Yuri was looking at Shiori. And so that says volumes. And I feel like, yes, I'm an outsider. Of course, I'm an outsider. But I don't find that to be important to the Japanese folks I know. Most of them, and certainly the ones that I know in the industry and in the Yuri and larger anime and manga world, have been super welcoming and don't diss what I'm saying. They're not looking at it going, no, that's totally not there. They're going, did you notice that? And I go, oh, yeah, I totally noticed that. And they're like, okay, that's cool. Because sometimes it's put there for entertainment, not necessarily for, they'll put something there and they leave it there. And if you want to see it that way, you're welcome to see it that way. And they expect that. And if you want to see it some other way, you can see it the other way. And they're trying to reach the broadest possible audience, particularly in stuff in the 2000s, where you had tons of little stuff that was seeded, but it wasn't necessarily meant to be anything. And it was like, do you want to pair that couple? You want to pair that couple? And that was to just reach the broadest possible audience. So my place as an outsider is, I don't want to say it's safe from criticism, because of course that is utterly untrue. But generally speaking, I haven't had as much backlash on that from any of the Japanese folks, because they appreciate that the things that they put there were recognized by somebody outside that. And I feel like by surfacing my biases, it makes it easier to understand if a reader finds my work valuable.
So you have a book.
I do.
Tell us about your book.
So my book, By Your Side, the first 100 years of anime manga, Yuri anime manga, is coming out in June. This is a collection of my writings, both critical and very not critical, on Yuri from the last 20 years. It includes lectures that have never been seen outside the lecture hall. It includes review pieces and overview pieces of series that were really key, like Sailor Moon, Revolution Girl Utena, Awai Hana, Sweet Blue Flowers, Maria Sama ga Miteru, Maria Watches Over Us. So these series, which were just keystone series in Yuri anime and manga fandom, I look at and I do retrospectives of. I talk about the origins of the word, I talk about the origins of the audience, I talk about the literary roots, and it's very roughly chronologically organized. So I start with sort of the beginning and, what is Yuri? And I have a couple of different essays about that for different locations. So some of them are very easy to read, some of them are more academic. And then I talk about early writings, and I go through the early 20th century into the mid-century, late century, when Yuri fandom started growing, and then into the current time. And I also talk about the words we've used and how that's changed over time. And also I have an actual chronology of like Yuri focused events, which I wanted to put down before everybody forgot the old ones. Because, fandom memory is like 2 years old. So I want to get all that stuff that's already now 20 years old is going to disappear. So I got all of that together, and then I started writing some new content, particularly because as I was writing things, new tropes were popping up, new series were popping up, whole new subgenres. Literally 2 new subgenres popped up while I was writing the book, and I wanted to capture them. So inevitably by June, this book will already be out of date, but hopefully it will give everybody language around which to do their own work. And since this has never been done before, and people have written articles about Yuri, but nobody's run a whole book about it. So I'm hoping that this kind of gives a basis for Yuri research, and I'm looking forward to all the Yuri research that comes out, having, read my book, and they go off and they run off and they do their own stuff on queer media and queer transformations of non-queer media, which is actually the next thing I'm going to do. And I'm really looking forward to this book being out.
Yeah, fabulous. So we've gotten some recommendations from you along the way of things that you particularly loved, but we had discussed in advance, make sure you've got recommendations for people. So what are some of your favorite or the classics you think people should consume that we haven't mentioned yet?
All right, so I'm just going to reiterate Sailor Moon, which is for little children. It's still amazing anyway. You should definitely watch it. Just get used to zooming through the transformation sequences and the attacks like really fast. You can watch we have watched all of season 3, the original season 3, in one day, having just skipped all of the openings, closings, transformations, and attacks. We got it through one day. It was like 8 hours long. But Sailor Moon is really great, and particularly season 3, which has Haruka Michiro. Revolution Girl Utena, which references so many of the earlier stories, including a series that you can now get on DVD from Discotheque, Dear Brother, which is a masterwork by the same woman who did Rose of Versailles. It's called Onisama E, Dear Brother. The manga has never been translated into English, but the anime is a masterwork. It is incredibly emotionally intense. And it's just about a girl in a high school where the politics are unbelievable. And it's done by a master director, Dazaki Osamu, and it's absolutely fantastic. So that's really good. And obviously the Rose of Versailles, anything by Ikeda is always good. Ryoko Ikeda. Maria Watches Over Us is an anime that has 4 seasons. It's out in English. And I particularly like it because it's a modern 21st century version of the old early girls culture-esque tropes. So it's modern, it's funny as hell. But there's some really intense stuff, and there's one actual lesbian character, and one of her story is told in one of the novels, but also in one of the anime series. Really good stuff. If you want fantasy, if you want a different look at magical girls, you could look for Puella Magi Madoka Magica, which is a really dark sort of magical girls story. And then the thing that I'm reading right now and obsessing right now is not an anime, it's light novel, which is an illustrated novel series. And then it's also a manga, which is coming out in English, both of them out from a company called Seven Seas. And it's called I'm in Love with the Villainess. And it is an isekai in which an adult character from our world, perhaps overworked, may have died, and wakes up one day suddenly in the world of her favorite RPG or her otome game. It's a dating sim game, where in the original game, as a protagonist, you're supposed to go for the princes, but she fell in love with the villainess. And so now she's after the villainess. It's 5 light novels. 4 of them are out in English. The 5th one is coming in July. I can't wait for the 5th one to come out because people's heads are going to go. I've read all of them. And then there's another series from the villainess's point of view, which is also really fantastic. And it's out as a manga. And I would highly, highly recommend that for queer readers because it has openly queer identity and discussions. In book 1, as you're sitting there, one of the characters says to the main protagonist, so are you one of those people they call homosexual? And I was like, are we actually having this conversation? Yes, they are having this conversation. And that's in book 1. And it doesn't get less queer. It actually gets more queer, and we get more real world identity. What it doesn't do is create a world in which queerness is fully accepted. In the country we started in, it's not. In another country, it is. But it uses those spaces to make critical commentary about contemporary Japanese life. And I think that was what that point was. And so that's really good. And I highly recommend that one. So since we're talking about isekai, I want to talk about a couple more titles that these are, again, light novels, which means they are novels generally speaking for young people. So they're written very easily, not complicated fiction. They have illustrations and they're very fast reads. But I want to talk about a couple more that might be interesting. There's I'm in Love with the Villainess. There's also something called Sexiled. my sexist party leader kicked me out, so I teamed up with a mythical sorceress. And that one takes the real world scandal of women having their scores downgraded by the Tokyo medical universities so that more men got in. That actually really happened in Japan. And when it found out, obviously it was a huge scandal. And so it takes that idea and puts it into another world, in a fantasy world, sort of an RPG, D&D type game, where the main character is the greatest powerful mage, but because she's a woman, she has to wear sexist clothing and is not allowed to be a mage or a knight or any of the things that she's good at. And everyone treats her really crappy. And so she and this mythical sorceress team up and they change the world together. So it's a really good feminist power fantasy because no one gets hurt. It shows the power of ridicule over violence. Really good series. And also really hard to read, but really excellently written. J.K. Haru is a sex worker in another world, which is exactly what it sounds like. Also, there's some interesting historical stuff for fans of Western comics. I want to mention two books that I think are really, really worth your time. The first one is Resistance, the LGBT Fight Against Fascism in World War II by Avery Cassell and edited by Diane Kensler. And it's not a comic, it's actually essays about fighters against fascism in World War II. And Diego Gomez does illustrations. And that's really a nice book we don't tend to think of comics necessarily historical, but obviously World War II should be very much on our minds right now. And we could see how queer people were actually up front in the fight. And the other comic I want to mention is No Straight Lines, which is 4 decades of Western queer comics. It's edited by my buddy Justin Hall. And it has, from the origin of the gay comics scene in the late 60s, early 70s, through the AIDS crisis, and into the modern age, dykes to watch out for and that sort of stuff. But it is very historical. And people don't think about that, but I'm looking back at these comics of the AIDS crisis thinking, I certainly was aware of all of that. And I was younger and I was old enough to know about it, but I was living a bit of a sort of suburban lifestyle and wasn't involved in it. These people were in the middle of this. And you want to talk about contemporary fiction that really, we don't see a lot of lesbian contemporary fiction in the AIDS crisis, but we're starting to see some of that more. And that was really a major historical turning point. And also Don't Ask, Don't Tell and some other stuff. So that's really good. I would highly, highly recommend those.
And we will be listing a lot of this information in the show notes, and you're going to supply me with notes because I can't necessarily follow all of those Japanese names.
No, I will absolutely give you all the notes, and I'll give you links to where you can find them and all that stuff.
Yeah, that would be lovely, especially for manga. If my listeners if you have a local comic and graphic novel store, by all means, yes, try to support them by ordering this stuff.
And if you don't, you can go to comicshoplocator.org and they'll help you out to see where your local shop is.
So if people wanted to learn more about your work or follow you on social media, where should they go? I know you have a website, yuricon.com.
Yes.
Any other places?
Yeah, yuricon.com, you can find all the essays that I and other people have written. So if you are interested in Yuri research or analysis, I recommend going to the essays page there and starting there, seeing what's out there, and then going ahead and running with it. If you want to read my reviews, my essays, my retrospectives of anime and manga, go to okazu, okazu.yuricon.com. That's my blog. I've been doing that for about 20 years. If you just want to hear me blather about stuff, you can go hit me up on Twitter. Okazu Yuri there. And of course, I have a Patreon, Okazu, and also Pixiv Fanbox, Okazu Yuri. And I think that's pretty much where you can find me. And that's basically, I'm out everywhere. I'm on Facebook as well, but the Facebook group pretty much has the same content, and it's a slightly different community where people can talk a little differently. But we have a Discord as well. So you can find me just about anywhere, and we'll be always talking about random Yuri stuff, plus also food. We talk a lot about Friedman communities.
Well, we'll put links to all of those in the show notes, along with, as I say, links to many, many of the things you've mentioned. Thank you so much for sharing your time with the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. And this was so fun. And I'm just enjoying your podcast so much. So I'm really honored to be here.
Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast. See the show notes for links to people and topics. Most shows will have a transcript linked as well. If you have a book announcement, a topic suggestion, or might like to appear on the show, please drop me an email. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate it and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and consider supporting our Patreon.